Welcome to the Integral Stage. In today's episode, we continue the series Fire from Heaven on the topic of spiritual transmission. Our guest today is Professor Michael Schwartz. Michael is a professor of aesthetics and art history at Augusta University in Georgia. I know Michael best from his astute and subtle writings on integral post-metaphysical philosophy and the philosophies of Heidegger, John Sallis, and Roy Bhaskar, among others, and also for his work co-editing the recently published volume on integral philosophy, Dancing with Sophia. But Michael is also a long-time spiritual practitioner and teacher, and has been leading an experimental Vajrayana-influenced practice group for many years now. We decided we'd like to talk to him about his experience with spiritual transmission, especially in intensive practice contexts. The interview will be conducted by my friend and partner in crime on the Integral Stage, Layman Pascal. I hope you enjoy it.
All right. I guess it's just us now. Well, welcome, Michael. My first question is, why on earth did you agree to do this?
Because I trust you guys, love you guys. That's the reason.
Yeah, fair enough. But what about the topic in particular? Like, why this topic? You could have joined us on integral evil or Satanism or UFOs. You joined us on this one.
I would say that this is a topic that I don't understand, and that it's a topic in which something is happening, or many kinds of things are happening, and this phrase is used in relation to them. And it certainly circulates in a variety of religious and spiritual communities. So it's alive. It's been alive for a long time, obviously.
Yeah.
And just what is transmission, or what does that word point to? Maybe it's different phenomena, is fascinating. And not something that are what I call our Cartesian prejudices, of our culture, our sense of being that is sort of in the background that we inherit in the West. It makes it challenging to talk about issues like transmission in religious and spiritual circles.
Yeah, I think we're kind of caught in a spot, a Scylla and Charybdis or whatnot. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
On the one hand, we have our culture, which seems like it doesn't really have a space for this conversation. On the other hand, we have traditional cultures that bring this conversation forward, but limit it in traditional ways. So how do we move forward? How do we open up a clearing for us to bring our experiences forward and try to articulate those experiences in a way that satisfies our culture and infuses it with the possibilities of transmission, whatever those are?
Yes.
So my first question for you is transmission even the right metaphor, right? Because something's transmitting to something. Is that how it works, do you think?
I don't know how it works. It's something like that. The problem with the word transmission is it has the implications of something like information or communication signaling. And is that what's going on? Is it just a matter of a kind of like a telephone transmission or a communication? Because I think transmission echoes that in our culture. I think the issue of transmission has to do with something like causality. That somehow a practitioner, a devotee in a religious tradition and so on, comes into contact with others or a field or something like that, and it, in some demonstrable way, changes their state and or contributes to a change in their being, moves them in a more direction of a permanent shift of a kind. And so causal efficacy would be one of the ways I would want to inquire into what the word transmission is pointing to.
Now, when you think about that change being made in someone,
yes,
just in your own sensibility, do you always think about it as a positive change?
Oh, no.
Or could it be a negative change?
It can be a negative change. I think that in the broadest sense, transmission is something we're impacting each other all the time, just on a kind of personality level, right? On a gross level, let's call it. I'm very interested in attachment theory. And I think it's a missing link in a lot of how Integral has couched its psychology. I think Integral's coming in late in the game. I discovered attachment theory and a related set of third wave psychotherapeutic techniques that get into the autonomic nervous system. So they're really—
How would you define the basic principles of attachment theory?
It's essentially that our brains are structured for co-regulation. That's the optimal state. Right. So we're really not closed off to one another energetically, in a sense. We're really in a kind of co-field, and that there are a lot of there are two adaptive states. Okay. You know, a few people are perfectly co-regulatory. But that really, the idea that we're starting our foundation in a co-regulation as the healthy norm, and that it's really like our nervous systems are really open to one another in some sense. They're signaling, they're energetically communicating.
If we're always mutually modulating each other,
yes,
and everyone and perhaps everything is mutually modulating each
yes.
other, what distinguishes the particular people and situations that we specify as being profound spiritual sources
yes.
of transmission?
Yes. Well, I think there's an intention and a linguistic framing, right? So it's sort of like, oh, I want to move into such and such a state of being. I want, usually it's some kind of greater sense of well-being. And, oh, well, if I go to this community, or I go to this teacher or this person, by spending time with them, participating in practices with them, some form of co-presence in some way, even non-locally co-present with them, I have a chance of making some kind of desired shift. So I think we're framing this pervasive co-modulating, it beautifully put it. We're framing it in a smaller package of some desirable developmental / evolutionary progression. That's how we're framing it, yeah.
So imagine a scenario in which I sit down with someone, and this is a person who has something going on in their body and or their nervous system that I admire, that I want to have in myself.
Yeah.
And that by being mutual with them in a certain way, we are able to influence each other, and I can take on some of their patterning into myself, whether it's wisdom or if it's a way of self-regulation, it's a way of neuroelectrically and chemically modulating myself. That all fits very well under the current paradigm. But in addition to that, how seriously do you take the idea of an additional special energy facilitating the process?
I take it seriously. I've thought about this philosophically for a long time. I've actually written about this and thought about it, all about science and powerful theories of science and all of that. I just think the scientific ontology is too limited. It doesn't actually account for the phenomena. So there's something else is conditioning to allow certain kinds of development, certain kinds of capacities to come forward. And they may be rare, but rare doesn't mean they're not true. And I think there's a mistake often that if something is rare, right, only certain people, a few people can do X.
Sure.
Say long distance energy healers, which sounds woo-woo in a Cartesian frame, but I know that there are people who have healed from working with such people and no other modality helped. And those so-called long distance energy workers have helped many people. So just statistically, something is happening, right? Something is going on, and it doesn't seem to be in terms of the usual ways we posit materialist energies. There's some other form of energy, some other frequencies that are happening that we tend to miss.
When you say scientific ontology,
yeah,
do you think that's a way of approaching the situation that is inherently limited, that is
Yes.
inherently predisposed toward matter and repeatable experiences and can't encompass this? Or do you think it's like a plant that is still continuing to blossom, that scientific ontology could expand to include this with further research and modifications of itself?
Sure. Sure. I think there's a danger in saying science as it's the scientific paradigm, let's call it. However it mutates, it has certain confinements to it, certain limits. I think there's a danger in thinking, oh, well, one day it'll get there. Because that promise has been around for a long time. And it ends up into a kind of scientism. And it begins to ignore certain phenomena and ignore certain other possible avenues of explanation and interpretation. So I wouldn't want to make it an endless future promissory note. I think that's dangerous.
Right.
So I just think that the traditions have the traditions are pointing to dimensions of being that are not woo-woo, they're just not as traditionally accessible. And then since fewer people have worked with them, there's just less understanding of what the mechanisms really are about them. That's my sense of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully this is the kind of conversation that helps in that process, which helps in two ways. One is helping in terms of thinking out what are the real possibilities here.
Right.
The other way is bringing in some experience of our own. So I would move on to a question like, in your own mind, what's one of the first vivid experiences you remember where you thought, oh, I'm receiving and or giving a transmission?
I have had many mystical experiences.
Sure.
So I'll give one example, a concrete one. A couple of decades ago, I was studying with Lama Surya Das in the Dzogchen tradition. And there was a summer I did not go to the 2-week retreat. And I was doing meditations. And the sort of manufactured imaging of Padmasambhava, you visualize the teacher in front of you. Mm-hmm. And that teacher kind of came alive spontaneously and began to do gestures and showed me things non-verbally that were really about, that I later learned were about Togel, about rainbow energies, and around emptiness. And I had not really made the connection that Padmasambhava was really linked to Surya until I went back and looked at a picture, and there was Surya and an image of. So I don't know what happened. I can't explain the actual mechanisms, but by somehow working with Lama Surya Das and tapping into this particular tradition, and I'm interested in many traditions, but in this tradition, something happened where I received a teaching that I did not verbally know about ahead of time and was nonverbal and deeper than a verbal explication. And I've had many of those experiences, and they're not uncommon. David Michael Levin, distinguished phenomenologist, in the appendix to his book, The Opening of Vision, he did a 10-day dark retreat. And in the last days, he had a vision of an object appeared before him in the darkness. And he didn't know anything about it until afterwards. And it was actually an important symbol in the tradition he was working in that just appeared. There's no way he had prior knowledge of this. So that's one of many, many, many examples of different kinds of experiences that could not be explained in terms of something like I had prior mental knowledge or something like that.
Both those examples, yours and Levin's, involve vision or visionary activation of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
So how often would you say your own experience of transmission involves something like vision as opposed to something like just somatic manifestations, activations, and flows?
Somatic, auditory, nonverbal understandings, state changes, sometimes profound. All of those can be part of entering some kind of for lack of a better word, a field. I don't know where the field comes from. I wouldn't assign it to a Cartesian subject generating a field. I don't know. But it's
here's a good question is,
yeah.
Do you think when people traditionally have talked about receiving something from a teacher or an adept of some kind,
yes,
but then they also switch into thinking about the phenomenon itself as the goddess or the force, or they think of the transmission power itself as an active agency, do you think that's a legit traditional way of getting out of the subject-object relationship, of getting into more of a field thinking by mythically assuming the active agency of the general phenomenon itself?
Yeah. But I wouldn't, that still is ascribing a form of agency that I don't know how to ascribe. Right. It's less bad than, Peter did it to me. Right, good old Pete.
The goddess is less bad than the guru.
Something like that. Yeah, I mean, the entanglements that happen with human personalities in this is one of the biggest issues.
Have you run into that yourself?
Oh my, yeah. Who hasn't? I mean,
what's an example of a problematic dimension of?
Well, someone claiming that they're special and they're the guru. I mean, and that you're only going to get it here. And and that this is the unique teaching, and no, it's just not my experience after a while.
Without promoting you as a teacher necessarily,
okay.
How have you dealt with that on the other side, right? I'm assuming as you've worked with this for years, things have seemed to have come through you to others.
Yes.
What do you do in order to keep that from becoming problematic?
Making it a group, trying to make it more of a group reception, partly democratizing it. Now the problem with that is that not everyone is at the same, let's call it frequency or developmental level or readiness. And so if you democratize it too much, it becomes a power struggle, grabbing for, so it decenters any authority. And so you can go to a green, space, and you can go to a kind of amber orange space where there's a singular person who's the authority in different ways. It's very hard to have a second tier space,
right,
in which everyone is invited and we all honor we have different capacities and there is some leadership structure of some kind, but it's fluid. That's a really, I haven't seen it really manifest in a healthy way in my personal experience.
When you think of a second tier version, what's the role of authority in that? Like you were talking about maybe a new kind of balance between some of these different forms that we haven't quite seen yet.
Yeah.
But at the same time, are there people for whom hierarchy is a facilitator of the process?
Yes.
Are there ways in which that sense of vertical superiority is an important aspect phenomenologically of enabling it to happen?
Yes.
Or is that always problematic?
No, it's not always problematic. It's the context, the people, and the particular teaching. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm one of my day jobs is a university professor, so I'm teaching Raphael, right? Who was a mystic, by the way, mystic painter, and amazing. So if I democratize, I've been looking at Raphael for many decades, and I am completely open to when students, and they're amazing, come up with insights that I've never seen in all the years I've looked. So that space is democratized in that sense. But if I was to not share my engagement with Raphael since I was 22 years old, that would be like withholding something. So pretending that there's not a holarchy there isn't an expertise of some kind, is false, and not actually in a non-gifting. So it's how it's held. It's how it's held. Now, universities tend to be more orange structured, right? A little green in there. A practice community that would be second tier would require a lot of healthy co-regulation. I didn't understand this until the last year or so. It really would require that everyone would be really geared up to moving into secure attachment with one another. So these personality shadows wouldn't be working under the ground. And then the second would be an ability to be very fluid, very shifting context and really fluid, where there could be a structure of an official structure of authority, but it would be something that would in the moment shift, where if something is coming through another person, that person would be the leading in that moment, and complete relaxation about it.
So there's an authenticity aspect to what I'm hearing and what you're saying, right? Which is that it would be inauthentic for me to say that I don't have decades of experience with Raphael.
Right. No, it's true.
In which case that would inhibit the potential flow and mutual co-regulation to optimal benefit of the situation.
Yes.
Now, there's another side to that, which traditional systems have evaded, which is a sharing of our lack, our shadow, our insufficiency. And so here's a question, which is, if a teacher presents themselves as human, as fallible, as imperfect, does that intensify the transmission through authenticity or diminish the transmission through failure to resemble the perfect Buddha?
Maybe neither. It's how one is presenting one's quote unquote shadow. First, a teacher has to be really open to the shadow, and that's not easy, right? Second, anyone in authority is projected on 5 times as intensely as anyone else. They're just the shadow projection, good, bad, in the middle. So there has to be an ability to handle that. I think it has to do with transparency and authenticity and vulnerability. Those are the qualities, I would say. It's not going, hey, I'm a schmuck. That's really just self-negating. That's just self-deprecating. I don't see that as a healthy pattern. It's different than saying, this is an area where I'm working on, and I'm open to feedback, and I want to continue working on it, and a group that can hold that with somebody who's in a leadership position. I think it's the group that has to be able to hold all of this, not just the individual who's leading or not. No, I think coming up with I'm perfect or I lack, I think those two are what we want to move past. As a way of framing.
Generally, I agree with that. But here's a finessed question about the I'm perfect thing.
Sure.
Which is there a special kind of transmission, which is the transmission of perfection?
Yes.
Of the completely realized state that only comes about when someone sets a context of complete achievement as opposed to endless unfolding.
So something like radical awakening contra evolutionary awakening or something.
Yeah. How do you feel about that?
I've seen people radically awaken without positing a teacher as being perfect. So, but seeing the teacher as perfect I think probably has and it helped induce certain people to receive that sense of the innate perfection of everything arising. Yes. So I think it could be beneficial and could lead to problems, because if someone doesn't awaken, or even if they do, they could still get trapped in power games anyway. So I don't think it's an easy answer to that. It's a great question. I don't think it's an easy answer. I like
No,
the
I think
question
these are all tough questions, because I think it's a discourse that's barely started in the
I
world.
agree. Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, it's a tough question.
So here's an equally tough question.
Mhm.
If we were putting together the Integral Handbook for Transmission, what one piece of advice would you give to transmitters? What one piece of advice would you give to receivers?
To transmitters, anti-glamour. The theosophical call for anti-glamour is something I do not think has been taken up in the integral community. This is Alice Bailey. This is Irving First. I take seriously this call of anti-glamour. To really, that's an energetic, that's a transmission to receive. That anti-glamour has to go really deep. With those who are the receiving side, or the student, whatever the relationship is in that context, I think they need to maintain their own power, their discernment, right? And be able to both surrender and both not lose their power, both to maintain a sense of their own agency and decision making in those contexts. Both.
That's a very tricky balance to ask.
Oh, I didn't say it was easy. No, I mean, you don't want to. No, it's an the ideal is an integration of basically surrender and agency, with discernment as leading that.
What would you say to somebody who was in a context with a powerful transmitter and a powerful context around that transmitter,
right,
where they didn't quite have the ability to hold on to their individual integrity?
Yes.
But they understood there was something amazing there that they could surrender to, and the transmitter encouraged that surrender. Should they go for it?
I couldn't answer for them. I'll tell you what, without mentioning communities, I have seen that scenario played out with a very prominent teacher who's no longer alive, and very few people really awoke, and tremendous damage was done to a lot of individuals. so something happened, but it was truncated.
Well, what about this? What about, I was talking to Mark Foreman about this topic recently, which was, how good is transmission for you necessarily, right? Like, what kind of person do you have to be in order to receive it? He was very interested in the old, you've probably read the Gopi Krishna books about Kundalini. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but the idea that he was having a kind of Kundalini turn on that he wasn't ready for. His diet was wrong, his mentality was wrong, his emotions were wrong, and as a result, it was detrimental to him, right? That the wires weren't ready to receive the electricity, and so he was getting a short circuit.
Yes.
So have you seen people who shouldn't have been receiving transmission?
Oh yeah.
Who didn't have the circumstances it takes in order to ground that safely?
Yes, absolutely. Many, many times, more often than not, actually. I think the tendency in our culture is to go for the transmission. Go for the candy, so to speak, almost.
Sure. Just do it.
Not to take account of context, grounding, safety, metabolizing, integrating in a safe way. I think I've seen it. I had one experience, so I've been fortunate, one experience in a retreat way overloading and then having to come down. but I've seen it happen to a lot of people in different degrees. I think this goes to an issue of what might be called transmission safety. Transmission sort of gradiating it, making sure it's safe, and finding ways of inviting the field to be sort of protective, in a sense. I don't think we do that enough.
Sure,
To invite a kind of protection into the space, and to monitor, what's really happening and what the effects are after the session, after the encounter.
In the Integral Transmission Handbook,
yeah,
there absolutely needs to be a chapter on that. And
yes,
a huge part of that chapter is just remembering that safety is a priority.
safety is a priority, and metabolizing is a priority.
Yeah.
And it's not just having big state experiences, and it's not just having an instantaneous shift. You can't predict how it's going to happen for you. It's being grounded about it. It's learning how to be grounded about it, and knowing that one's process in a particular field will have a distinctiveness to it. Just because someone else is going, in this frequency, you may be going like this, and that needs to be honored. And it's not a cookie cutter. It's not a, everything goes like this. Doesn't work like that. There really is an individuation to it. That needs to be honored. The singularity, not just the universal, the singularity of an individual's process.
That seems like a place where developmental theory has a lot to add to the conversation, because cookie cutter thinking seems appropriate to a particular type of person and a particular stage of cultural complexity.
Right.
Right. And they have to, historically, they've had their transmissions, and some of them have been fantastic, but they also have problems that they don't know how to accommodate, that we have to look at from a more sophisticated perspective, which is why we're having conversations like these. Now, what about this? If you had to choose between a powerful spiritual transmitter who gave you no wisdom instruction, or a wisdom teaching that did not have transmission in it, what would you pick?
Right. And I would say that it depends what dimension I was working on in my own being.
Oh, good answer.
So, if I was looking to crank up certain kinds of vitality and energies, or I might say, hey, let's go for the all on, and I'll find another way of framing it and figuring it out and fine tuning it. Because if I don't get that charge, I'm not going to move forward in that area of my development. And there are other areas where that's not worth it. What I really need to do is have a frame, and maybe I can find techniques or find other resources to move through it. So I think both of those are options, and it really depends upon my capacity at that time with those options, and then what I'm trying to do, what I'm actually trying to develop in my being.
Follow-up question: does the way you weight those options, has that changed over your life? Would you have made a different decision earlier?
Yes, I mean, I was the crank it up, man, like just I mean, way too intense about practice, which didn't metabolize all the time. I would have state experiences, and it would not metabolize, and sometimes go sideways a little bit. I mean, not in terms of breakdowns, but just a little bit. I think I've learned to honor a much more intuitive, multidimensional, paced approach to evolution. And it took a while. It took good people around me. It took some more co-regulation and patience.
It took patience and good people around you.
Yeah.
What else did it take in order, like, what does it take in order to metabolize well and in order to have the right pace?
Metabolizing well. You need safety. You need to feel secure enough. You need, you can't have the lower parts of the personality system on high alert. If you have the lower parts of the personality system on high alert, autonomic and more than the autonomic, it's really hard for the shifts to quite get in there. It really requires personality integration and then a context that has a degree of safety. And I think that actually enhances metabolism, enhances integration, and you go faster than you think. You may not have explosions, but you go faster.
I love this emphasis on safety that you're bringing into the conversation.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. And it seems like one of the dangers is that people might not notice that their transference upon the other is a function of their lower circuits.
Right.
So that they might think that that is the aspirational goal of the process, when really it's one of their lower activations.
Right, it is. But it can come out anytime, in any way, any state. You know, it can be present. And so I'm a real advocate of what is called in theosophy and in Irving First's sun work, personality integration. I think that is, no matter what access, what development, where the vantage point is, personality integration seems to me to be a real focus, a real important piece that sort of goes along with whatever the more esoteric dimensions that are opening and unfolding and carrying one along. I really
love
think
that you're bringing theosophy into this. My grandmother was hardcore theosophist. And my early experience of these kinds of concepts were the books that she left for me on the bookshelf before she died, that my parents never read, but she told me they were for me before she died. So I always aspired to read them as I aged.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's fantastic. Yeah, I'm really enjoying the trans-himalayan teachings, Bruce Lyon's work and John Daru's work, their work. Yeah, that's really resonating for me. And I've been working with Irving First's teachings, the Sun Network, which is sort of unknown, which is all transmission. And it's all about.
What would you say, what's the core of that approach then? When you say it's all transmission,
it's all about attuning to fields, pre-existing fields, and you tap into them, and then all of a sudden you can practice in a different way, and it's noticeable. It's like turning a switch on, and it's extremely multidimensional, just amazingly dimensionalized, all the way down, all the way up, sideways, and yeah, I mean that's why this notion of a field is more appealing to me than something like an individual. Like there's something in the field of being that's more than what science has yet been able to sort of touch, that in a first person way, in a first and second person inner way, so to speak, can be accessed, and something's happening and it's repeatable. And but yeah, it's like turning a switch on. It's like receiving something, and then all of a sudden there's access to that current, and there's certain practices that enhance it, and some development happens. And yeah.
You and I have talked a little bit before about states of consciousness in the integral sense.
Yes.
So when you think of turning a switch on, do you think of turning on a very generic switch that is the same in most cases? Or are there several different switches that might get activated?
I think a lot of switches. The integral thing's a nice big sort of bucket model, but take something like Integral's notion of the non-dual. I think there are so many flavors of non-duality, and I think I might have written a text message to you quickly once about this. I like Heidegger on this. I use Heidegger. Heidegger talked about the revealing and concealing of being. Like humans don't quite have full access, right? Something's withdrawing. And that metaphor may have to do with non-duality. That non-duality is not a ground that's groundless. It's a ground that's receding. It's pulling away. So there's no one way. There's no one style of non-duality. And there may be no limit in deepening in the non-dual, rather than thinking of the non-dual as a kind of, foundation or noun. The non-dual itself is something that's plural in some sense. So that a Christian felt sense of that, like Bernadette Roberts, her experience of that, and a Zen teacher and a Tibetan, they I think, my touching, they have a different feel. They're not quite identical to one another.
So I'm glad you brought up Heidegger here, because his, regardless of his conclusions, his approach to trying to language being is exemplary. And how much of it he took over from Husserl, I don't know exactly, but there's a very nuanced attempt to feel out the words for the experiences we're having.
Yeah,
that's very profound. And that's something that hasn't been brought into the transmission discussion very much, because mostly we've either had no discussion or a traditional linguistics discussion on the subject.
Yes.
So this is very important that we try to do what Heidegger might have done on the subject of transmission.
That's interesting. That would be interesting. He was very nuanced about language and phenomena. Very much.
One of my questions for you would be, what's the relevance of articulating the experience of transmission relative to having the experience of transmission? Does it help? Is it an epiphenomenon? Is it central? Does it inhibit? Does it facilitate? Is it irrelevant to the experience?
I think it facilitates. I think that the mental plane is an energetic, it's active, and it can be a barrier or it can be a receiver, right? It can hold things away. It can also orient us. It can orient us to transmission. So I think our languaging, even our sub-languaging that we're not even aware of, as personalities, can have a profound effect upon our receptivity, our ability to metabolize, how we metabolize, how well we metabolize, what we resist. I think it's important. I call these sometimes with a capital F frameworks. These frameworks are energetic themselves and impact transmission, among other things.
I agree. Where else would I like to go with this?
Yeah.
It's funny. I had a question a second ago. It was very clear. Now it's gone. How about this? In an individual session, let's say, if we can call it that, your personal experience of working through something in a transmission-like manner, is it largely the same from one experience to the next and from one teacher to the next? Are there radical differences, or is there a fundamental underlying similarity to how it works through you?
I have not reflected on that. It's a great question. I have not reflected on that. I think it varies from tradition and field to field. I think you can. I have had sessions within a lineage which were similar, a similar kind of effect, a kind of immediate experience, let's call it. But other times, it can just be completely different day to day if you're working in that way. It can happen, not happen, happen strong, happen weak, work somatically, it can shift, even within the same practice regime that's trying to access something, that's inviting a transmission. Yeah.
What would you do to intensify the experience if you wanted to do that?
Well, it depends on what I'm working with, but I would check in if anything's blocking.
Right.
I would see if something is blocking, if there's something in the way. I would see if there's a complementary practice or process that might enhance. I would experiment if I wanted to intensify with both something to amplify and something to block anything that might be obstructing. I would explore intuitively. I go, oh, maybe this will work, that'll work. And then all of a sudden, and I mean, I've had this experience, and then all of a sudden it's much more powerful and profound. Yeah.
Do you think that intensification of power is the result primarily of that of your impulse to explore and experiment? Like, are you activating the same thing in every case in a very basic way, or is it a specific, like, I have this particular block and then I freed up this particular block and then it happened? Or is it more like I implemented my general procedure and my general procedure seems to work? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think the general procedures get refined where they start to work.
Yeah.
And then they cannot work, and then you got to adjust them. I think any practice is not mechanical; it's organic.
Right.
So, one could be doing something like Vipassana meditation, say, and then one style of Vipassana is killing it, and then all of a sudden it goes flat. Right? And so it's like, why am I doing this? And so I might shift to another mode and see if that actually works.
That's very interesting, because there's an argument in some traditions that when you feel dry, when you feel bored, that's good, it's working, keep doing that. But then there are other people who might have more neurosomatic awareness or sensitivity to stimulation, and they might decide that that's not working and that they should make a little shift.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
I that's a great, study. That to me would be a study. What I have in mind is Jeffrey Martin, who's done all this research on what he calls PNSE, the states of what we might loosely call awakening, which cut through the traditions. And what he discovered is people stick with practices too long. Like, his research showed that people will take up a meditation practice and it actually doesn't fit them, but they have a conceptual mind that I've got to be a Zen meditator, and they'll meditate for 30 years and not a lot will happen. And so it's finding the practice that is working, and then when it stops working, because you've changed, you may need to adjust the practice. That's his approach. Now, I don't know if that's true in all cases, but that's at least how I was responding, was this idea that as we change, the practice has to change.
That's my own experience as well. And I try to be sensitive to arguments that say, pick a side and go with it. You know what I mean? That you're somehow, if you're constantly modifying your practice, you're somehow spiritually promiscuous. You're never going to really understand what a spiritual marriage is. I'm open to the argument, but in practice, the benefits to myself have always seemed to involve modulating the practice based on how it's actually affecting me organically.
Yes. Yeah, that's what his research is pointing to, at least in this one area, in this area of sort of like more non-dual consciousness. That's what he's pointing to. That's what he's come up with. He thinks that's the number one problem. That's the number one impediment, is people stick with a practice that doesn't work for them.
So here's a more philosophical question, which
Sure.
is, where are these energies coming from? Are they coming from the individuals exchanging? Are they general parts of the overall self-regulation of the biosphere? Are they coming into our world from some other part of the cosmos or some other dimension? What's the source of these energies?
Yes, yes, and yes. They seem to exceed the biosphere. They seem to exceed individuals. I'm using seem. They seem to come from vast sources. That's how they self-present imagistically and in a felt sense. And that's repeatable by people, right? So a group will practice, generations will practice, and it's like, oh, when I tap into this energy, which is profoundly transformative, and I radically shift, and I have new capacities as a being, right? They seem to be coming from something that's not in the biosphere, noosphere, physiosphere. They're coming from somewhere else. That's the first person, second person experience. Science can't even touch them at this point, right? So that's our least bad guess. That's how I'd frame it. I mean,
that's a very fair position.
Yeah, that's our least fair guess. It's our least bad guess. Yeah, that's my sense
All
of
right.
it.
Here's something that really intrigues me, which is there some kind of configuration that facilitates this process? Is there something in common in the neurophysiology of an individual who seems to be a powerful transmitter and certain areas of the landscape or biosphere and certain kinds of cathedrals or human architectural constructions that all facilitate the same process? Is there a common result from a particular configuration style, or are these all very different experiences?
That's a great question, and I do not have enough experience with sacred sites that people have had experience. Repeatedly, people have had certain experiences, even transformative experiences, nor architecture. Although I visited a lot of architecture in my life, I haven't really had that kind of experience with architecture. But people report they do. So I would say that that's a research question, right? That would be tracking people going to and having certain experiences and tracking their development from there and comparing. That to me seems researchable. But it's a little outside my personal experience.
No, that's great. And I think figuring out which corners of this phenomenon are researchable is a hugely useful project. You know, we may not do that research ourselves, but just to open up those pathways to make it really obvious that somebody could potentially just do that.
No,
that's really useful.
I agree. And there's some research. I mean, I was looking over a book we read a few years ago called Subtle Activism by David Nichol. And in the book, he reports the Maharishi effect, where there's been 12 studies of this. And it's essentially TM meditators. They go into deep states as a group, and they meditate in a locale, like a city,
Mhm.
and they do it over a period of time in a systematic way. And it correlates, we don't have a cause, it correlates in every instance that's been studied, apparently, with lower crime rates, demonstrably lower crime rates, shifts in behavior that might be inferred from something like a more peaceful consciousness of a kind. And
I've seen those studies myself, and
yeah,
the only other source I personally know of similar studies is the Heart Math Institute, which talks about neurocardiosynchrony. And
yes,
they have some interesting similar studies about the indirect or secondary effects in regions of doing these practices.
yes,
And so and because of my personal experience of both those kinds of practices, I find it hard to resist the idea that there is a contagious coherence effect of
right,
some kind.
right. No, I think it's fields. I think the biggest craziness of the Cartesian ontology is this radical separation of the mental and the physical, or the skepticism around the mental. It's just, whatever good it served, it just seems, how can consciousness, whatever consciousness is, how can it not be part of a field? It's just, I'm articulating it really poorly, but there's something bizarre to truncate what a field is. So I think that all of this is field in some sense, right? And so, sure, it's going to spread in some way, that we know and don't know. And it intuitively makes sense it could have an impact in the coherence way you're suggesting.
It's a very interesting extension of the Cartesian idea. And, from my point of view, Descartes gets a lot of critique that isn't necessarily warranted, because I think he was more profound than my university training led me to believe.
Right. And I'm not.
However, that distinction between the subjective and the objective, if we've decided now that the objective environment consists of energetic fields of infinite distribution, which we have decided, why would we not decide something similar about the other half of the Cartesian proposal?
Yeah, and I'm very careful that I say Cartesian and not Descartes.
Yeah.
I think Descartes was a subtle thinker. Cartesian, I mean sort of the kind of general cultural ripple effects of a kind of implicit ontology that permeates the culture not in background ways. That's my understanding of it. But you just articulated beautifully what I was intuiting and couldn't speak. Yeah, why can't the subject be a field as well? And why aren't they interpenetrating rather than discrete or separate or alienated, I would say. Yeah,
you
exactly.
obviously bring a lot of intellectual nuance to this experience, and so I wonder what it was like for you to undergo transmission experiences where you may have, at the same time as the experience, been critiquing it, been disagreeing with the statements of the transmitter. What's that like for you? Because I've been in experiences like that myself.
I guess the initial experiences where I didn't quite trust them. I think the main thing was I didn't trust them. So I needed some kind of external validation. So I would kind of research them, right? But what I'd come across is that other people have had the same kinds of experiences. And I guess that calmed me down a bit. The mind calmed down about it.
Yeah.
The main issue was trust. And that's been something that's deepened over time. So I've relaxed into this, to use the metaphor you coined, this subject interpenetrating object field, subject field, and very dimensional, beyond what we tend to think, at least as far as we can tell. Relaxing into that as that and trusting that in some sense.
That's interesting because it jives very much with your emphasis on safety which is a contributor to the feeling of trust.
Yes.
So there's something you're pointing to, which is trust and safe and relaxed. There's some kind of state there which you are sort of implicitly proposing facilitates this process in an intelligent manner.
Yes. Yeah. And the intelligence, who knows where that intelligence is coming from, or even what intelligence is, you know? I'm always reminded with that word that after the 17th century, intelligence got associated with the mental substance, the mental plane. But prior to that, intelligence or intellect was a Latin translation of nous, which was something more than the mental plane. So something happened in our language use with a word like idea or intelligence or intellect, where it kind of had a wider implication and got moved into the subject in some senses.
Now, I imagine that we're rotating back towards that to some degree, and that my experience of people under 40 is that they mean something much broader by the word intelligence.
Yeah, well, they have artificial intelligence and systems,
and also the difference between conscious and unconscious intelligence, and that's an interesting feature here, which is on the one hand, a person who's very sensitive to somatic interiority might be able to polarize themselves to a transmission and track a lot of interesting phenomenon, and that's available to their conscious inspection. However, the next person in the Sangha may not have that sensitivity. And are they undergoing the same phenomenon or some equivalently interesting phenomenon that's going on in their unconscious that they're not able to track and sense?
No, I think that's true. I think that's one of the challenges of group practice, that you can engage in a practice. The practice may have a desired direction it's moving everyone in or people in, and it's doing all kinds of different stuff. And then how do you speak about that? And how do you correct it? Like someone is doing a practice that's to move them into, I don't know, causal emptiness, say. And they start speaking about, I saw a toad was speaking to me. They have some kind of archetypal experience. Oh, that's great. But then how do you hold that fully in the space? And what does it mean to practice together? What does it mean to do the common practices if people are going in 18 different directions?
How dangerous do you think the arising content is? Because I know there are some teachers who will say, be very cautious if you see the magic toad, or if you achieve a siddhi, throw that away, don't focus on that, right? Is it really a danger, or is it something that whatever's coming up for you, you go into that and you come out of it at your own pace?
I'm not the danger thing. I could be wrong about it, because I'm stressing safety and trust, but I'm not one to think the stuff arising is usually dangerous. I think if unconscious material, trauma material is coming up, that's something that needs to be, that's different. That really needs to be held in a something outside a traditional spiritual community, in a space, a therapeutic space that can hold that. I think it's a mistake.
How would we secure that? I mean,
I think you have to.
Trauma material can arise for people. So
I think it does arise.
Do we have an expectation that the teacher is attentive to that?
I don't think teachers know how to
is attentive, or that there's a therapist on hand, or
maybe it's more like
cultural context that tells us we should be alert to that.
Yeah, I think. Well, this is the whole issue of trauma. So I think that's an expanded word, but one I like, because it's talking about those early experiences. Let's just stick with a model of this life that could not be metabolized. So, intense shadow in some way. And I think most people, in that definition, most people have some degree of trauma from their childhood. Most, not all. And so there's been, Thomas Hubel just had a whole series on trauma. And Diane Poole, in a smaller way, with a group of these third wave therapists, had a whole set of video teachings on this, a conference. And what I've come to understand about trauma is it's something that's just not held well traditionally in religious and spiritual communities. It's very specific. And I think going forward in an integral way, there should be a chapter on that, on trauma and how you would build safety into a community that could meet that arising that's specific to trauma arising in some way, and not make it into
the way I
something
normally
else.
hold the word trauma is something like overload. It's too much or too soon. You know, and the extravagant example is childhood sexuality, which is to say, even if there's no violence and a child thinks they had a good time, it's still traumatic for an adult to have sex with a child. The reason is it's too soon.
Right.
Their system hasn't been integrated.
Right.
So is there something analogous to that in spiritual transmission? Is there too soon?
I think there's something analogous to it. I don't know if it works quite the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wouldn't know. That would be the mechanisms, because the personality is of a much more robust, dimensionalized character in an adult. So probably has more ability to handle overload in a way.
It's an interesting question, because
it is.
I would associate it with the verbal teaching is what I would be more concerned about personally, right? That there's an equivalent to sexual trauma in terms of dogmatic education of children. They might receive their religious information too soon, and it might violate their integrity and lead them to be dogmatic as opposed to simply metabolizing it. So that's normally where I would be concerned. But I've never really thought about whether transmissions could come too early or not. It's an open question.
Yeah, no, I think it could. Look, I mean, Mark was talking about that, wasn't he? He was talking about his system wasn't ready for the Kundalini energies to move. And I've seen people blown up by Kundalini energies moving too soon. So there's an example of a kind of a form of quote unquote trauma, where the energies can't be metabolized and actually do something harmful or negative or not desirable in some way. So I'd say yes to you. The Kundalini would be the perfect example of that.
When you're talking about these difficulties in metabolizing, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is psychic inflation and the tendency of a person to think that they are already a god in a golden universe.
Well, I've seen it. And then I've seen it more than once. And there's almost like a form of dissociation. Yeah, it's inflation and dissociated. They're not even like tracking.
Do you think there are ways we could inspect a person beforehand to know whether they were vulnerable or not to those effects?
Yes, I do. I think I think we could probably design a set of tools to explore what they're likely to be able to handle at a given point and what they're not able to handle at a given point. I think we could, I think we actually have enough knowledge about. It's funny to say this, to be able to design something like that. So it would be sort of a refinement of the guru in certain lineages saying, you're not ready for this teaching, you are ready for this teaching. Which to me always had a kind of amber feel to it. And this would be a more researched version of that. And I think we could design something like that.
I think so too. And it's the kind of thing that an integral framing might be useful for.
Yeah, I agree.
Right?
Yeah.
Because when you did that, you have to analyze it through different stages. You have to look at different aspects of the person and all those sorts of things. We'd have to make sure that the analysis of those results didn't collapse.
Right.
So what's for you? What are the open questions here? What do you still want to know about the process of transmission?
I want to know the mechanisms. I think they're different. I think what's being called transmission are more than one phenomena. Maybe they interrelate, but they're not identical. I want to be able to sort of articulate that. I would like to, in a practical sense, be able to deploy transmission to benefit development, healing, well-being, the evolutionary impulse, and then to design approaches, community structures, all quadrant approaches that would enable transmission to flourish appropriately and safely and actually maximally at the same time. Those would be some of the inquiries, and like this research, this sort of pre-research of what someone could handle and what they couldn't handle. That could be part of something like that. Be very valuable and could really prevent a lot of pain and speed things up in some ways.
Yeah, I think we need a solid analytical and secure structure in order to enable this to flourish in the culture that we have. And, for me, the question of transference is a really prominent question, which is, first of all, what's the distinction between receiving transmission and, placebo effect of imagining you've received transmission, but also to what degree does transferring your golden shadow onto someone facilitate the process, right? There is a lot of these teachings in the East where they would say something like, the degree to which you imagine your teacher is the perfect Buddha is the degree to which that teacher can transmit enlightenment to you.
Right.
Right. And that means something like the more you transfer yourself onto the teacher, the more the process mechanically functions. And that sounds both risky, but intriguing if it's really the way that it works sometimes.
Yeah, I don't, maybe it doesn't work in every culture.
Yeah.
There could be a cultural it's fascinating.
It might be level dependent in the integral sense. Like
level dependent, but also
might be, if you are at amber, what do you need? If you're at orange, what do you need in terms of a transmission context?
I think it's true.
Those are really open questions.
That's actually my experience. I don't have an answer to it, but I think what happens to people when they're in a particular memic state is very different how transmission works. Completely different. The amber might bow, might project parent and, powerful parent. Orange might have respect. Green might rebel. Green will go, what about my voice? Wait a minute. So I think those are really charged in terms of the ability to how they metabolize a transmission field. Definitely. Yeah.
So I'm just about to invite Bruce back into the conversation, wherever he is.
Yeah.
But is there any, I'm loving this conversation, and thanks for having it with me.
Me too,
Michael.
yeah.
Is there any outstanding things that have come up for you? Any questions you have? Like anything you want to add in before we bring Bruce back?
I'd say the one thing that I'm concerned about is people walking around and claiming they have transmission. That is really common. Like people just starting to meditate, talking about, hey, I've got transmission. And this is why I think the anti-glamour,
right,
which is an energetic, this anti-glamour is so important. And if there's one thing that could kind of curb inflation, inflation, deflation, I think it's that. I think that's an important piece.
Overall, like looking at human evolutionary history,
Mm-hmm.
do you think that's more dangerous than a culture in which transmission is denied or not?
I keep going to context. I think it's at what point in human history. So I think right now, I think transmission is essential and to get it right.
Yeah.
I think we need to people have some sense of development, all the self-help books, all the development books, some sense they can transform themselves. It's an impulse. And some sense that we can grow and evolve. There's some latent sense in many cultural sectors.
Yeah.
So if that's true, and we actually have a call to grow and deal with climate change and other issues, among others, transmission has to play a big role. So I think this is where we need to learn how to do transmission well.
I think so too, and I think it fits into a more advanced cognitive framework, which is that we know that we don't know everything that's going on. Whether everything that's going on is the ecology, or whether everything that's going on is the rest of our psyche in the background. What's the rest of the interaction between us that we don't see? There's a ton of stuff that isn't in the forefront of our cognition. And we've got to take that into account in a rational fashion in order to move forward, I think.
Oh, I like that. I agree with that. Yeah.
All right. Bruce, are you there? Nice jacket.
Yeah, I thought it was a fantastic conversation. Really, really enjoyed it. For the sake of everyone listening, I actually would like to ask you to say, what is anti-glamour?
Anti-glamour is a transmission that cuts into this need to shine and attract attention, like Hegelian beautiful soul. It cuts into ego self-importance, ego inflation. It cuts into, it's hard to talk about, the felt sense of it, but it actually is a kind of preparatory ground. It's not defeating. It prepares for this greater sense of sort of soulful love and caring to come forward. So I'm not exactly sure what it does. I know what it feels like. I know it's not a great answer, but it really is about, it's the opposite of social media, much of social media. It is the opposite.
That's a great answer. The opposite of social media.
Yeah. It's not grabbing for attention. It's not self-deprecating. It's just not grabbing for attention and not trying to shine artificially. So an example of glamour would be, oh, well, I have some, I've developed some practices and I have energies and look at me, I'm shining, or my eyes shine, look in my eyes, or that's glamour.
Yeah, posture.
That's glamour. Yeah. It's a greater humility. Maybe that's another.
I'd just like to say what a great time I had, and
me too.
What a sweet sense I always have in dealing with you, Michael. So
the same with you,
very much.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's great. I really appreciated you and the whole thing. Yeah.